The large hall was silent except for the sound of shoes shuffling on the polished wooden floor. It was a very important day for everyone who had gathered there, but the mood was not friendly. The air inside the room felt heavy and cold, like a winter morning that refuses to warm up. This was the final round of the regional piano competition, and the tension was so thick you could almost touch it. People in expensive suits and dresses sat in the audience section whispering to one another. They were looking at the program sheets and then looking at the contestants with critical eyes. Near the back of the room stood a young woman named Elara. She did not look like the others, who were standing around with their heads held high, showing off their confidence. Elara was wearing a simple white blouse that she had ironed carefully just that morning, and a long black skirt that she had bought second-hand a few years ago. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, but a few loose strands fell over her face. She kept tucking them behind her ear nervously. Her hands were clutching a folder of sheet music so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. She looked at the floor most of the time, afraid to make eye contact with the wealthy families and the stern-faced judges sitting at the long table in the front. Other contestants did not pay much attention to her. They were busy talking about their expensive pianos at home and their famous teachers who had trained them since they were 3 years old. They laughed loudly and used big words to show off their knowledge of music theory. Elara listened to them, but stayed silent. She knew she was different. She did not have a grand piano in her living room. She did not have a famous teacher. She had learned on an old upright piano that her neighbor had let her play after school. She practiced every single day because she loved the music, not because she wanted to impress people with Manea man with the gray beard and a suit that looked like it cost more than Elara's car. Walked up to the microphone. His name was announced as the head judge. He looked out over the room with tired eyes. He had been listening to young pianists play all day long, and he was clearly bored and impatient. He adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat loudly. The sound echoed through the hall and made everyone jump a little. He called out the next name, which was Elara's name. Elara took a deep breath and felt her heart beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stepped out from the shadow of the curtain and began walking toward the stage. The walk felt longer than it actually was. Every step seemed to take an effort, as if she were walking through deep water. She could feel dozens of eyes following her move. She felt small in the big empty space between the audience and the stage. The lights were very bright, and they made her squint a little as she climbed the stairs. The judges watched her approach without any expression on their faces. The woman sitting to the right of the head judge was looking at her watch and tapping her pen on the table. She looked like she wanted to be somewhere else. The third judge, a younger man with glasses, was looking through a stack of papers, not even bothering to look up when Elara walked by. They had already decided what they thought about her before she even touched a piano key. They saw her plain clothes and her nervous posture, and they made an assumption. They thought she was just another amateur who was out of her depth. When Elara reached the piano, she felt a sudden wave of calm wash over her. This was where she belonged. The piano was a massive black beast of an instrument, shining under the stage lights. It looked intimidating, but to her it looked like an old friend. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it carefully, pulling it forward just an inch. She needed to feel comfortable. She placed her folder of music on the stand and opened it up. The pages were worn and slightly yellowed with use. She smoothed them out with her palm. Head judge sighed loudly and leaned back in his chair. He crossed his arms over his chest and stared at the ceiling. He clearly expected this to be a waste of time. The other judges continued to fidget with their papers and their pens. The audience members in the front row whispered to each other and pointed at Elara. They wondered why someone looking so simple would be in a competition like this. They thought it was going to be a simple performance, maybe a child's song or a slow boring piece that lacked skill. Elara looked at the keys for a long moment. She did not rush. She took a slow breath in and let it out. She placed her hands on the keys gently. Her fingers were slender and her nails were cut short. The wood of the piano felt cool and smooth under her fingertips. She could hear the rustling of people in the audience and the sound of a cough from the back of the room. The judges were still not looking at her. They were waiting for the first note so they could tune it out. Knew they were judging her. She could feel their doubt hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. They thought she was simple. They thought her music would be simple, too. But Alara had a secret. She had a connection to the music that went far beyond technical drills or expensive lessons. She had a story to tell, and she was about to use the piano to tell it. She flexed her fingers slightly and prepared to play. The silence in the room grew deeper as everyone waited for the sound to begin. The head judge finally looked down at her and raised one eyebrow as if to say, "Get on with it." Alara ignored his impatience. She focused entirely on the instrument. In front of her, the black and white keys were not just plastic and wood to her. They were a voice. She closed her eyes for just a second to visualize the sound she wanted to create. And then she opened them again with a new look in her eyes. The nervousness was gone, replaced by a look of intense focus. She was ready to show them that what looks simple is often hiding something incredible. She lifted her hands high above the keyboard, and the room held its breath. Her fingers came down on the keys, and the first sound that filled the hall was not a loud crash or a fast run of notes, but a single soft tone that seemed to hang in the air like a ghost. She let the sound fade away completely until there was nothing left but silence again. Then she played another note, and then another. The melody she was playing was very basic. It sounded like a folk song that children might sing in a playground. It was slow, and it had a steady rhythm that anyone could tap their foot to. The tune was so simple that it felt familiar, even though no one had heard it before. The head judge let out a breath that was almost a snort of disappointment. He looked down at his paperwork and picked up his pen, ready to write a low score. He had expected something complicated and flashy, but this was just a basic tune. He whispered something to the judge sitting next to him without moving his lips too much. They both shook their heads slightly. It was clear to them that this girl did not have the skill level to compete at this event. They thought she was playing it safe because she was afraid to make a mistake. They thought she was hiding her lack of ability behind a slow tempo. People in the audience started to lose interest. Almost immediately, a few people in the back rows leaned back in their seats and crossed their arms. The man in the expensive suit near the front pulled his phone out of his pocket and started checking his emails, thinking that the performance would be over quickly and he could wait for the next contestant. The music was not demanding their attention. It was just floating there in the background, like elevator music. No one was looking at Alara with admiration anymore. They were looking past her, wondering when the real music would start. Alara did not notice any of this. Her eyes were closed lightly as she focused on the feeling of the keys under her fingertips. She knew exactly how much weight to put on each note to make it sing. She was not playing fast, because she did not need to. She was exploring the simplicity of the melody like it was a precious jewel. Every note was round and full and perfect. She was not rushing through the phrases. She was letting them breathe. There was a complete stillness in her body that contrasted with the nervous energy she had shown when she walked onto the stage. Music continued in the same pattern for a long time. The right hand played the sweet high melody while the left hand played a few simple chords to support it. It was pleasant, but it was not exciting. The judges were now writing on their clipboards with vigor, making marks that would lower her score significantly. They were convinced that this was a waste of their time. The woman judge checked her watch again and tapped her foot on the floor impatiently. She wanted to hear something difficult, something that showed years of training. But all she heard was a simple song that anyone could play. A young student in the audience, who was studying music, rolled his eyes at his friend and whispered that this was the easiest piece he had ever heard all morning. They both giggled quietly, thinking that Alara must have been very confused to think she could win with such a basic performance. The room was filled with the collective feeling of boredom and arrogance. The people there thought they knew everything about music, and they thought that because the notes were easy to read, the music had no value. But Alara was just getting started. She was laying a foundation that no one else could see. She was building a house brick by brick, and the others were too busy looking at the sky to notice the walls going up. The melody began to change just a little bit at first. She started playing the notes a bit harder, giving them a sharper sound. The rhythm stayed the same, but the feeling became more intense. It was like the weather was changing from a sunny day to a cloudy one. Head judge stopped writing for a moment and looked up. He noticed that her posture had changed. She was leaning into the piano now. Her shoulders were tense, and her hands were moving with more purpose than before. The notes were still the same simple folk song, but there was a new power. Behind them, the sound was bigger and fuller, filling every corner of the large hall. The people who were looking at their phones started to look up, because the sound was suddenly demanding their attention. The left hand, which had been playing soft background chords, began to play a repeating pattern that was darker and lower. It created a rumbling sound that vibrated in the floorboards. The contrast between the sweet high melody and the dark low rumble created a strange feeling of tension. It was not a happy feeling anymore. It was serious and heavy. The simple tune was starting to sound like a memory that was trying to be forgotten. Judges exchanged confused glances. They stopped writing and just listened. The piece was supposed to be simple, but it was starting to sound complex. The way she was balancing the two different sounds in her hands required a lot of skill. It was not just about hitting the right notes. It was about controlling the weight and the tone of the piano in a way that very few musicians could do. The girl they thought was an amateur was showing them a depth of control that was usually only seen in the greatest players. The atmosphere in the room shifted completely. The boredom vanished and was replaced by curiosity. The audience sat up straighter in their seats. They were trying to figure out what was happening. The music was still moving slowly, but it felt like it was going somewhere important. It was like walking down a path that leads into a deep forest. The simple beginning was just the entrance, and now they were going deeper into the woods, where the shadows were long and the light was dim. Alara's face was calm, but her eyes were burning with emotion. She was no longer sitting on the bench. She was inside the music. Every note she played meant something specific to her. It was a story she was telling without words, and the story was getting more intense with every measure. She did not care about the judges or the audience anymore. She was playing for the music itself. She was proving that simplicity is not the same thing as emptiness. The dark rumbling in the left hand grew stronger, and the sweet melody in the right hand began to break apart. A single wrong note seemed to sound, but it was not a mistake. It was a deliberate clash of sound that made everyone in the hall flinch. It was a harsh sound that stabbed through the beauty of the melody like a knife. The judges looked at each other in shock. They wondered if she had lost her place. But Alara did not stop. She kept playing with even more force. At that one strange note changed everything. The simple folk song was gone now, and in its place was something that sounded ancient and sad. The music was no longer polite. It was raw and honest. It was exposing a pain that no one expected to hear in a competition hall. The people who had been laughing were now silent. The man who was checking his phone put it away in his pocket without taking his eyes off the stage. The head judge leaned forward in his chair, resting his chin on his hand. His expression of annoyance, replaced by a look of intrigue. Performance was no longer simple. It was a battle taking place on the keyboard. The left hand was fighting the right hand. The darkness was fighting the light. Alara was using the basic melody they had mocked to take them on a journey they were not prepared for. She was showing them that true mastery is not about how many notes you play, but how much meaning you can put into each one. The room was completely captivated now, and no one dared to look away or breathe too loudly. They were all waiting to see where she would take them next. The sound that filled the hall was no longer just a collection of notes, but a living, breathing entity that seemed to grow with every second. Alara's hands were moving in ways that confused the eye. Her left hand was jumping across the low end of the keyboard with a speed that was startling, creating a deep and driving rhythm that felt like a heartbeat during a race, while her right hand continued to play the soft and simple melody on top of it. The contrast between the two was jarring and mesmerizing all at once. It was like watching a peaceful swan gliding on water, while underneath the surface, the feet were paddling furiously against the current. Judges who had been so ready to dismiss her were now frozen in their seats. The woman with the glasses had stopped looking at her watch completely, and was now staring at Ilara's hands with her mouth slightly open. She was trying to understand how such a small person could create such a powerful sound without looking like she was struggling very much. The complexity of the music was hidden inside the simplicity of the melody. It was not showing off. It was just existing with the strength that demanded respect. The head judge narrowed his eyes and leaned forward. His elbows resting on the table, he was no longer bored. He was analyzing every chord, trying to figure out where the simple piece was taking them. The audience had forgotten about their phones and their whispered conversations. The room was so quiet that you could hear the wood of the piano creaking slightly under the force of Ilara's playing. The air seemed to vibrate with the sound waves bouncing off the high ceiling and the polished floors. A young man in the front row who had been smirking when she walked on stage was now sitting up straight, his face pale and serious. He realized that he had judged a book by its cover, and he had been completely wrong. The music was not amateur, it was masterful in a way that he had never experienced. Befarilera felt the sweat beading on her forehead, but she did not move to wipe it away. She was completely lost in the world of the music. The notes were telling a story that she had kept inside her for a long time, a story about hard work, doubt, and the burning desire to be heard. She was not playing for the judges anymore. She was playing for every person who had ever been told they were not good enough. She was playing for the late nights she spent practicing on a broken keyboard. In a tiny apartment, she poured all of that emotion into the keys, and the piano sang it back to the room with a voice that was loud and clear. Melody began to change shape again. It started to twist and turn like a river flowing around rocks. The rhythm in her left hand became more complex, adding syncopated beats that made the listeners want to tap their feet, but they were too stunned to move. The music was building a wall of sound around them. It was thick and rich, and it felt like it was going to lift the roof off the building. The judges were now looking at each other with expressions of shock and disbelief. They knew that they were witnessing something rare and special, a moment where the musician becomes one with the instrument. The difficulty of what she was doing was immense. Her hands were doing completely different things at the same time, requiring a level of brain power and muscle memory that took years to build. But to the audience it looked effortless because she was so relaxed. Her posture was perfect, her back was straight, and her wrists were loose. She moved with the music instead of fighting against it. The sound coming from the piano was warm and full. It did not have the harsh, tinny sound that less skilled players often get when they try to play loud notes. It was a pure and beautiful tone that resonated in the chest of everyone listening. Lights above the stage seemed to shine brighter as the music intensified, reflecting off the black shiny surface of the piano. Ilara's face was calm, but her eyes were burning with intensity. She was seeing colors and shapes in her mind as she played, translating the emotions into physical movements. The music was no longer simple, it was a complex web of sound that was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. It held the audience captive in a spell that no one wanted to break. The silence in the room was heavy, but it was not an empty silence. It was a silence full of awe and wonder. People in the back rows stood up quietly so they could see better. They did not want to miss a single note. The energy in the hall had shifted completely from arrogance to respect. The man in the expensive suit who had checked his email earlier was now holding his breath, his eyes fixed on the young woman at the piano. He felt a strange feeling in his chest, a feeling of being moved by something real and authentic. He realized that all the money and status in the world could not buy the talent that was on display right in front of him. Music reached a point where it seemed like it could not possibly get any more intense. The sound was filling every corner of the massive space. The vibrations were strong enough to be felt in the seats. Ilara's fingers were flying across the keys, now blurring together as she moved from the low end to the high end of the keyboard. She was using the entire instrument, making it sing and roar and whisper all at the same time. The judges had put down their pens completely. There was nothing to write down that could capture what they were feeling. They just listened with their hearts open. For the first time that day, Ilara felt a surge of adrenaline as she approached the next section of the piece. She knew that this was the part where the music would shift again from the chaotic complexity back to something else. She did not slow down. Instead, she pushed the tempo faster, driving the rhythm like a hammer hitting a nail. The audience felt the speed pick up, and their heart rates went up with it. They were on a roller coaster ride of sound, and there was no getting off until the end. The simple tune that they had mocked at the beginning was now a distant memory, a faint echo buried under layers of incredible musical architecture. The head judge shook his head slowly in disbelief. He had been playing music and judging competitions for decades, and he had never seen a performance like this. It was technically perfect, but it was also full of raw human emotion. It was the kind of performance that reminded him why he fell in love with music in the first place. He looked at the other judges and saw that they were thinking the same thing. They had misjudged this girl completely. They had looked at her plain clothes and her quiet demeanor, and they had seen a victim. But she was actually a G, and the sound of the piano was roaring now, like a lion that had been woken up from a deep sleep. The notes were crashing into each other, creating waves of sound that washed over the audience. Alara was hitting the keys with conviction and purpose. Her whole body was involved in the music, swaying and moving with the rhythm. She was no longer the shy girl who walked onto the stage with her head down. She was a queen sitting on her throne, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The transformation was total and complete, and no one could look away. The complexity of the music was starting to peak. The many different layers of melody and rhythm were weaving together into a tight knot that felt like it might explode. The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone was waiting for the release, waiting to see how she would resolve the storm she had created. The air was hot, and the silence was deafening. Even though the piano was making a huge amount of noise, the silence came from the people who were completely absorbed in the moment. They were not just listening to a song. They were experiencing a life-changing event. Elara's hands moved with the precision that was scary to watch. She knew exactly where every note was. She had practiced this piece 1,000 times in her head, and now it was flowing out of her like water from a fountain. The difficulty was immense, but she made it look like the easiest thing in the world. This was the mark of a true artist, someone who could take the impossible and make it look simple. The judges were now realizing that the simplicity they had mocked earlier was actually the sign of a genius at work. The music had now transformed into a roaring storm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old concert hall. Alara was no longer sitting quietly on the bench. She was fully engaged with the instrument, her body swaying and moving with the rhythm as the sound grew louder and more intense. The melody from the beginning was still there, but it was buried under layers of complex chords and rapid runs that danced up and down the keyboard. It was like watching a peaceful stream suddenly turn into a raging river during a flood. The power coming from the piano was immense, and it filled every corner of the room. Physical effort required to play at this level was visible on Elara's face. Small beads of sweat formed on her forehead, and her breathing became deeper and more rhythmic, matching the pulse of the music. Her fingers moved with a speed that was almost frightening to watch. They were a blur of motion, hitting the keys with precision and force, yet somehow maintaining a delicate touch where it was needed. The independent movement of her hands was mesmerizing. Her left hand was maintaining a driving, rhythmic pattern that never wavered, while her right hand soared above, playing intricate melodies that twisted and turned like a bird in the wind. The judges were completely mesmerized by what they were seeing and hearing. The head judge had abandoned his bored posture and was now sitting on the edge of his seat, his eyes wide with astonishment. He realized that the simplicity he had mocked earlier was actually the foundation for a masterpiece of technical skill and artistic depth. The difficulty of coordinating both hands to play such different parts at the same time was something that only the most elite pianists could even attempt, let alone execute, with such grace and confidence. The woman judge had stopped writing altogether. She was just staring at Elara with a look of pure awe on her face. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted from polite indifference to absolute captivation. The audience felt like they were witnessing a historic moment, a rare performance where the musician disappears and only the music remains. The sound was so rich and full that it seemed to vibrate in the chests of everyone listening, People in the back rows stood up to get a better view, unable to stay seated in the face of such powerful artistry. The young man who had laughed earlier was now gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles white completely. Stunned by the transformation taking place on stage, Alara was in a state of flow where time seemed to stop and the only thing that existed was the music and the instrument. She was not thinking about the competition or the judges or the people watching her. She was pouring her soul into the piano, expressing emotions that went far beyond words. The music was telling a story of struggle and resilience. It spoke of hard times and hopeful dreams, of pain and ultimately of triumph. Every note was charged with a raw energy that made the performance feel incredibly human and real. It was not a sterile display of technique. It was a living, breathing, emotional journey. The complexity of the piece continued to increase as Alara navigated through sections that required lightning-fast reflexes and immense strength in her fingers. The sound of the piano was like a full orchestra at times, with deep, rumbling bass notes that shook the floor and sparkling high notes that cut through the air like crystal bells. The contrast between the soft, gentle passages and the loud, thunderous chords was jarring and beautiful. It kept the audience on the edge of their seats, never knowing what would come next. The tension in the room was palpable. Like the feeling just before a thunderstorm breaks, judges were now struggling to keep up with the level of musicianship on display. They exchanged glances that acknowledged they had been wrong to judge her based on her appearance or the quiet start of her piece. They realized that true artistry is not about showing off with loud bangs from the beginning, but about taking the listener on a journey and building something meaningful. The man in the expensive suit, who had been checking his phone earlier, was now completely motionless, his phone forgotten on his lap, as he watched the young woman with the second-hand clothes dominate the stage with the power of a true master. The music seemed to reach a plateau of intensity where it stayed for a long moment, hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. The rhythm was driving and relentless, pushing forward with an unstoppable force. Alara's arms were moving in wide arcs as she reached for the keys at the far ends of the keyboard. Her entire body was an extension of the instrument. She was not separate from it. She was one with the piano. The connection between the player and the music was so strong that it seemed to radiate outwards and touch everyone in the room, creating a shared experience of awe and wonder. As the climax of the piece approached, Alara began to introduce even more dissonance and conflict into the music. The harmonies became tense and clashing, creating a feeling of unease and excitement that made the audience hold their breath. It was like watching a tightrope walker taking a dangerous step. Everyone wondered if she could maintain control of such a chaotic and demanding sound. But she never faltered. She navigated the complexities with ease, her fingers finding the right notes without hesitation. Her confidence was absolute, and it shone through every sound. Shimedeth's sheer volume of sound was incredible. Now, the piano was singing at the top of its voice, filling the vast hall with a wall of sound that was both beautiful and overwhelming. It was a sonic representation of the human spirit fighting against the odds. Alara was showing them that she was not just a simple girl with a simple song. She was a force of nature, a musician with a voice that deserved to be heard. The judges sat in stunned silence, realizing that they were witnessing a performance that would be talked about for a long time. The energy in the room reached its peak. The air felt electric and charged with the emotion of the music. Alara was playing with a ferocity that was breathtaking to watch. She was giving everything she had, holding nothing back. The performance was a testament to the countless hours she had spent practicing alone in her room. While others doubted her, it was a victory for every person who has ever been underestimated or overlooked. The music roared like a lion asserting its dominance over the space, demanding respect and commanding attention. Slowly, Alara began to bring the storm under control. The chaotic rhythm started to smooth out. The loud, crashing chords began to space themselves out, giving the music room to breathe again. She was guiding the listener out of the turbulence and toward a resolution. The transition was handled with incredible skill. It was like steering a ship through rough waters into a calm harbor. The intensity faded, but the emotional impact remained. The audience was left breathless, their hearts pounding from the journey they had just been taken on. The music was shifting once more, preparing for the final phase. Alara's movements became slower and more deliberate, her face softened as she prepared to deliver the closing message of her piece. The judges leaned forward, unable to look away. They knew that the end was coming, but they did not want it to stop. They were completely under the spell of her playing. The silence of the room was heavy and profound, waiting for the final notes to fall and bring this incredible display of talent to a close. Alara felt the energy in the room peak and then slowly start to come back down, like a tide going out after a violent storm. She guided the music back to the simple melody she had started with. But it was different now. It had been through a journey, and it sounded wiser and deeper. The notes were soft again, just like in the beginning, but they carried the weight of everything that had come before them. Her hands moved gently over the keys, caressing them rather than striking them. The audience was leaning forward, waiting to see how she would end this story. They were no longer bored or cynical. They were completely. Hirsch reached the final bar of the music and played two notes that resolved all the tension that had built up in the hall. It was a perfect ending, a feeling of coming home after being lost for a long time. She did not lift her hands off the keys immediately. She let the sound ring out into the vast space, allowing the vibration to touch every single person in the room. The wood of the piano seemed to hum under her fingers. She held her breath, listening to the sound fade away into nothingness. When the last trace of the sound disappeared, the hall fell into a deep and heavy silence. It was not an awkward silence. It was a respectful, awestruck silence. No one moved. No one coughed. No one whispered. It felt like the entire world had stopped to listen to the echo of what she had just done. The air seemed to vibrate with the memory of the music. The judges sat, frozen with their pens hovering over their paper, unable to write a single word because words felt inadequate to describe what they had just heard. The head judge looked at the young woman sitting at the piano with a new kind of respect. He realized that his initial assessment of her was based on his own prejudices and not on the truth. He had judged her by her clothes and her quiet demeanor, and he had been completely wrong. He saw the talent and the fire that she had hidden under a calm surface. He felt a small pang of guilt for underestimating her, but mostly, he felt amazed that he had been lucky enough to witness such a performance. The woman judge had tears in her eyes, and she did not bother to wipe them away. Alara sat with her hands resting on her knees for a moment longer. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, which was thumping loudly from the exertion. She felt a sense of peace wash over her that she had never felt before. She knew that she had done her best. She had poured everything she had into the music, and she had left nothing on the table. The fear that she had felt when she walked onto the stage was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. She knew that she did not need their approval to be good, but it felt good to know that she had changed their mind. Slowly, she stood up from the piano bench and smoothed down her skirt. She turned to face the audience and the judges. Her face was calm and composed, but there was a sparkle in her eyes that showed she was still feeling the adrenaline of the moment. She looked at the people who had ignored her and the judges who had dismissed her. She did not look at them with anger or arrogance. She just looked at them with a gentle gaze that seemed to say, "I told you so." Without speaking a word, suddenly a single person started clapping from the back of the room. It was a slow and rhythmic clap. Then another person joined in, and then another. Within seconds, the quiet hall erupted into a thunder of applause and cheering. It was not the polite clapping that people give out of obligation. It was a loud, raucous noise that came from the heart. People stood up from their seats and shouted their approval. The sound was overwhelming, and it filled the space, just like the piano music had done only moments before. The sound washed over Alara like a warm wave. She stood there for a moment, taking it all in. She saw the young man who had laughed at her earlier standing and clapping with a look of sheer amazement on his face. She saw the man in the expensive suit wiping a tear from his eye. She saw the judges standing up as a sign of respect. It was a complete reversal of the atmosphere from when she had walked onto the stage, and it was a victory that she would cherish forever. Alara gave a small and humble bow. She did not milk the moment or try to take up too much of their time. She just bowed once deeply, and then turned to walk off the stage. As she walked away, she could feel the energy of the crowd following her. It was a warm and welcoming feeling that made her skin tingle. She walked with her head held high, this time not looking at the floor, but looking straight ahead towards the exit with a sense of purpose and prettiness. She stepped behind the heavy curtain and out of the spotlight. The noise of the hall seemed to fade a little, but she could still hear them calling her name. She leaned back against the cool brick wall and let out a long breath that she felt like she had been holding in for years. She looked down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. They were the same hands that had worked odd jobs and struggled to pay rent. But they were also the hands that had just moved a room full of strangers to Tersh. Knew that her life might not change overnight. She would still have to work hard and face challenges. But today, she had won a victory that meant more than a trophy. She had proven that talent does not always wear a suit and speak with an educated accent. Sometimes, talent is quiet and humble and wears second-hand clothes. She had shown them that true music is not about showing off how fast you can play, but about touching the human soul. Stage manager came up to her with a wide smile on his face and gave her a bottle of water. She took it with a nod and drank deeply, feeling the cool liquid soothe her dry throat. She could hear the judges asking for her to come back out for an encore, but she knew that she had said everything she needed to say with her performance. She did not need to go back out there and prove it again. The silence after the music had been the loudest sound of all, and that was enough. She thought about the simple melody she had played at the start and how it had grown into something so complex and beautiful. It was just like her life. It had started simply, and people had underestimated her, but she had grown and developed layers of depth and strength that no one could see unless they took the time to listen. She smiled to herself in the darkness of the wings, and knew that she would never let anyone make her feel small again, because she knew the truth of who she was. The applause continued for a long time, echoing through the building and seeping into the walls. Alara closed her eyes and listened to the sound, letting it fill her up. She felt grateful for the moment and for the chance to show the world what she could do. She realized that the most important approval did not come from the judges in their expensive suits, but from the feeling in her own heart that told her she had done something true and real. And that was a feeling that no one could ever take away from her.